Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry to interrupt your lunch. Hope everybody's getting enough to eat. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Steve Eggert. I'm an alumnus of the class of 1982 and a trustee of the college. And thank you all for coming for this, what we think will be a very interesting speech, okay? On a topic that I know is near and dear, interesting to me. So a lot of times students want to know the background of, they don't hear from other trustees as much as our president or chair. So I'm class of 82, ROTC, International Relations, went to law school, then eventually formed a business. We build apartments. That's what I do. And a trustee is a member of the board of directors of the college, where we meet on campus several times a year and and we set the governance, the guidance, the general direction for the college. So, and what another important thing we do is we support the college in many ways with our time, talent, and treasure. And one of the ways we do it is great gathering spaces like this, which are enormously important. I came on the board in 2010, and this was tired, threadbare. It was 35 years old since it had been built, and we needed a facility which would match the stature of both our distinguished guests, one of whom is here today, and matching the stature of the members of our community, our students and faculty, staff, and other stakeholders. So when I joined the board, Steve, what would you like to do? I go, we got to get this place up to speed. Well, you're a real estate developer, go for it. So I took it on. And so we got it all freshened up with a design and construction team, and threw a few dollars at it. I think an efficient number of dollars at it, and got it looking like it is today. And this is the centerpiece. This building and this room is the center of Claremont McKenna College. I don't have to tell you that. And also, in my opinion, the center of the Claremont colleges. Geographically, I think about is. So, and I know we have some members from some other Claremont colleges here today to listen. And so, interestingly enough, shortly, within a few years after this, the Athenaeum was rehabilitated. This became the scene of one of the most interesting days in the recent history of Claremont McKenna College. And I want to point out, as Jill Stark, who's here, Jill's right here, that we have 4 speakers every week, every lunch and every dinner, so 8 speakers a week. We've had over 4,000 speakers here, and none of them have been interrupted or prevented from speaking, except one time, and that was last year. And that was, that was Heather McDonald, and that was a part of the storm that's gone over all of the academic world, not just here, but it has, with that incident here as much as possible. So that sparked my interest even further in what can we do to further support freedom of expression, free speech on campus. And concurrently, our college president was percolating an idea called the Open Academy, which you'll hear more about soon to come, which is the promotion of freedom of expression on campus. So with all that as a part of the celebration of the Eggert Dining Room, which I've got a little plaque over there now, pretty cool. We thought that one of my fellow alums said we should bring in a distinguished speaker to be a part of the celebration. And so I'm also active in the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and I was sat at a dinner last year, sat next to Professor Peter Berkowitz, who is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Professor Berkowitz has a long and distinguished biography, which you can, I don't think we have materials, but you can see certainly online. But a few highlights about Professor Berkowitz is he got his bachelor's degree from Swarthmore College, a peer college of ours. He received his master's in Israel, and a JD and PhD at Yale University. he has several areas of academic interest, but most importantly, for us, is one of his areas of interest, of most interest, is academic freedom and freedom of expression and liberal education. And so, you know, as I was learning this and as we met each other last year up at Stanford, just was the ideal distinguished speaker to help us celebrate the dedication of the Eggert Dining Room. And so, and I said, gee, if you can come for dinner, could you also come for lunch? Because there's other people that, you know, would love to hear from you. And he graciously agreed to come join us here for lunch. So thank you all for being here to listen and learn. I'm looking forward to hearing what Professor Berkowitz has to say. And let me introduce to you Professor Peter Berkowitz.
Thanks very much. Well, first of all, I want to thank Steve for the generous invitation to come to Claremont, actually for me to return, after having been invited by Professor Thomas a long time ago, and to be given the opportunity to speak on what I regard as a very important subject, liberal education. So, as I've come to understand, less so, and happily less so, at Claremont College, where things are fairly healthy. But throughout the country's campuses, free speech is embattled. So is liberal education, and that's not a coincidence. Vigorous speech, vigorous free speech, undergirds liberal education. And a proper liberal education exemplifies the benefits of free speech and teaches its enduring principles. Now, there's a tendency to think that the troubles on campuses are relatively new. They date maybe from the bad spring of 2017, which included not only Heather McDonald, but Milo Yiannopoulos at Berkeley and uprisings at Evergreen State College. Some people date the troubles back to 2015, when Yale college students strongly protested the idea that they, the college students, would be in charge of the Halloween costumes they would wear. But the truth is that the trouble on our campuses has been a long time in the making. In 1951, the young William F. Buckley published God and Man at Yale. It documents, through an elaborate study of course syllabi, the use of the curriculum to advance political aims. In the late 1960s, the public interest devoted a special issue to universities. At the time, students were demanding the transformation of the curriculum into a vehicle for advancing social change. In numerous cases, administrators and professors complied. In the 1970s, many students of the 1960s brought to graduate school programs in the humanities and the social sciences the view that scholarship and politics should be seen as politics by other means. Politics by other means, you will recognize that as a famous formulation from Clausewitz. In the late 1980s, not long after the first wave of 1960 students became tenured professors, an obscure professor of political philosophy at the University of Chicago published a book about the decline of higher education that became a surprise New York Times bestseller. In The Closing of the American Mind, Alan Bloom argued that colleges taught a dogmatic relativism that impoverished students' souls and left them ill-prepared to understand liberty and self-government. Bloom advocated a return to the study of great books. In the late 1990s, 20 years ago, in the late 1990s, University of Pennsylvania professor Alan Charles Kors and Cambridge, Massachusetts attorney Harvey Silverglate published a book called The Shadow University, 20 years ago this year, The Shadow University. They carefully examined higher education's betrayal of free speech and due process. In 1999, 19 years ago, Corzine Silverglate established the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE. Over the last 20 years, the organization has confronted a mounting workload of cases concerning free speech, concerning the defense of free speech and due process. And what about today? Over the summer, Brown University removed from the university website a research paper by a physician and Brown Assistant Professor of the Practice of Behavior and Social Sciences. Why? Because the research suggested that gender dysphoria occurring in puberty could possibly result from peer pressure. So much for free speech. Also this summer, more than 40 prominent academics wrote a letter to the New York University president and provost to demand that charges of sexual misconduct be disregarded against postmodern literary theorist Professor Avital Ronell. Why? Because, the prominent academics argued, Ronell is a distinguished scholar and she is their friend. So much for due process. A few weeks ago, some Yale Law School professors canceled classes. Why? To allow students to travel to Washington to protest then Judge, now Justice, Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation to the Supreme Court. For the same purpose, the University of South Maine offered students a tuition-free credit to transfer to Washington to engage in political protest. So much for a non-politicized curriculum. Today I want to discuss some of the more dramatic examples of how universities have lost their way, and want to emphasize, you all may have a skewed perspective because, near as I can tell, liberal education is prospering here at Claremont. But around the country, it is not so. So, in particular, I'm going to examine the struggle over free speech. But I want to argue that the struggle for free speech is also bound up with the struggle for due process and the struggle for a solid core curriculum. And all three, free speech, due process, solid core curriculum, are part of the struggle for liberal education. So I'll go about that in the following manner. First, I want to offer some general thoughts on liberal education, drawing on John Stuart Mill's great, but almost altogether forgotten, rectoral address of 1867. Second, as I mentioned, I'm going to examine some debates about free speech on campus and connect them to the dilution of due process and the hollowing out of the curriculum. Third, and this depends a bit on how much time remains, I want to explore John Stuart Mill's ideas about the spirit, the form, and the content of liberal education. My suggestion is that Mill can assist our colleges and universities in recovering their bearings and in serving the purpose for which they were created, or I should be more accurate, for which they were maintained, which they have been maintained in liberal democracies, which is the acquisition and dissemination of knowledge and the pursuit of truth. The acquisition and dissemination of knowledge and the pursuit of truth. First of all, a question we don't ask enough. What is liberal education? Well, it's certainly very important, and it's because I think liberal education is indissolubly bound up with our freedom, our prosperity, and our national security. I'll say more about that. But I want to emphasize that the liberal in liberal education does not mean progressive or of the left in accordance with common political usage. Rather, the liberal in liberal education refers to the modern tradition of freedom, the tradition out of which the American Constitution emerged. This tradition holds that human beings are by nature free and equal. It regards government's chief purpose as securing individual rights that are shared equally by all. It regards legitimate government as grounded in the consent of the governed. It secures the rights shared equally by all through limited government, through free markets, through a vibrant civil society. To maintain America's experiment in self-government requires an education for freedom, a liberal education, But what is the content of liberal education? What are the rules and norms that shape the communities, colleges and universities, in which liberal education takes place? What is the spirit of liberal education? Oddly, universities these days rarely ask such questions. Now, in the matter of liberal education, we do well to follow John Stuart Mill, the outstanding liberal thinker of his age, and perhaps of any age. Mill forthrightly addressed the topic of liberal education in 1867 in a rectoral address delivered to the University of St. Andrews. He had been elected rector of the university. This is an honorary position. Mill's sole responsibility was to deliver an address. And he chose to address the question, what is liberal education? It's a fascinating speech. I urge you all to read it. You can find it easily online. Now we have only occasion to emphasize one aspect of it. That is his definition at the beginning. Mill was at pains to distinguish liberal education from professional education. What's professional education? Professional education is education for remunerative labor. Law school, business school, medical school. Professional education. What's liberal education? Mill defines it quickly, concisely. The aim of liberal education is to form, I quote here, capable and cultivated human beings. Close quote. Capable and cultivated human beings. Capable and cultivated for what? For freedom, for flourishing as free individuals, for self-government in both senses, for governing oneself and for participating in the governance of the nation. How does liberal education do this? Liberal education furnishes minds and refines minds, argued Mill. Liberal education furnishes minds with knowledge of literature, history, math and science, economics and politics, morals, philosophy, and religion. Liberal education refines minds by teaching students to ask hard questions, by teaching students to see matters from a variety of points of view, by teaching to respect dissenting opinions, to examine them, and to find the portion of truth they contain. This is one of Mill's exhortations, important exhortations to understand that almost always the dissenting opinion contains some truth in some mixture worth appreciating. In furnishing and refining minds, liberal education can't help but temper judgment, foster civility and toleration, and enhance thoughtfulness. These are essential qualities for citizens of liberal democracies. So while liberal education doesn't yield directly professional knowledge, liberal education does yield a kind of knowledge and a quality of mind that will make you not only better citizens, but more capable, wiser practitioners of whatever profession you choose to enter. Unfortunately, and once again I emphasize, I'm speaking broadly about the condition of higher education throughout the United States. It's not overall in a healthy condition. It's exposed to three major threats. There have been attacks on free speech and efforts to curtail it. There's been a denigration and dilution of due process, and there has been a hollowing and politicizing of the college curriculum. I want to emphasize that these threats are not isolated and independent. They are intertwined. All of them, the threat to free speech, the threat to due process, the threat to the curriculum, are rooted in what Mill calls, I quote here from the opening pages of On Liberty, an assumption of infallibility. An assumption of infallibility. To remedy one, to make progress in the defense of free speech, for example, requires progress in remedying all problems with due process, or the attack on it, the problems with the curriculum. But let me concentrate, in accordance with my mandate, on free speech. from free speech codes, trigger warnings, microaggressions, safe spaces, and biased response teams, to disinviting speakers and shouting down lectures, we see free speech under attack in a variety of ways. Why has free speech fallen out of favor? There are numerous explanations. One part of it is that students come to college with a poorer understanding of free speech than they once did. But also, according to polls, a surprisingly high percentage of students, when free speech is explained to them, say they don't like it, they're opposed to it. And that's because they discover that free speech permits harmful and hateful speech, which, by the way, is true. A more sophisticated version of the argument goes like this, that there is a conflict between free speech on the one hand and diversity and inclusion on the other. The more free speech, the less diversity and inclusion. Why? Because free speech, which allows harmful speech and hateful speech, it's said, creates pain and suffering for marginalized students, which inhibits their ability to participate in the life of the college. It seems to me that this way of thinking springs from a faulty understanding of free speech and of diversity and inclusion in education, both of which, I want to emphasize, are goods that the university should foster: free speech and diversity and inclusion. Yes, words wound. This is something almost all of us learn in childhood. But the cost of regulating speech greatly exceeds the benefits. I often hear, "I'm with you. I'm for free speech too." But what does free speech have to offer historically discriminated against minorities and women? Well, the short answer is simple. It offers them the same precious goods it offers to everyone else: the ability to speak their opinions and the ability to listen to the opinions of others. The longer answer begins with 3 observations. First, today, and for some time now, women have constituted a decided majority of students among the undergraduate population across the country. Approximately 56% today of undergraduates across the country are women. If you add to the number of students who are women the number of students who come from historically discriminated against minorities, you get not just a majority, but a supermajority. A supermajority on campus now. A supermajority comprises women and historically discriminated against minorities. When we attempt to limit speech to protect that group, when those members of that group support limitations on speech, they're actually doing what majorities, in this case a supermajority, have always done throughout history: shut off, close down, and stamp out the speech of others. The majority, in this case a supermajority, is imposing its will to silence dissent. Second brief observation. Far from a tool of oppression, as freedom of speech is sometimes presented, free speech has always been a weapon of those who lack political power. Think about the United States. Abolition. The progressive age, the progressive reform of excess in the late 19th century and early 20th century. The movement for women's vote, civil rights in the 1950s, gay rights, transgender rights today. All of this is unthinkable without freedom of speech. Third, a campus that upholds free speech, that's truly dedicated to it, is by nature diverse and inclusive. Why? Because it offers marvelous benefits to everyone, regardless of race, class, or gender. the opportunity to express one's thoughts with the best evidence and arguments at one's disposal, and the opportunity to listen to and learn from a variety of voices, some bound to complement and some sure to conflict with one's own convictions. And at least, free speech offers the opportunity to live in a community, a special sort of community. You will live in many different communities throughout your life, but only when you are on a university campus, a healthy university campus, like Claremont, do you have the opportunity to live in a community that is dedicated to intellectual exploration and the pursuit of truth. Now, throughout the land, too often, it seems to me, once actually would be too often, universities encourage students to see themselves as weak and wounded, as frail and vulnerable. The universities encourage students to see certain opinions as essential to their identity and to believe that opinions that contradict their own perpetrate violence against their person and invalidate their humanity. I myself believe that students should be encouraged to view themselves as made of sterner stuff. We in the university world should be training students to be strong, skeptical and curious, conscientious and bold, attentive, cool, and clear in conversation. We should teach students to see the acquisition of knowledge and the quest for truth as essential components of their identity. In the near term, what might be done to reinvigorate free speech on campus, and again, this applies especially around the country, a number of steps can be taken. Abolish speech codes and all other forms of censorship. Publish a formal statement setting forth the purpose of free speech. I understand that Claremont College was an early adopter of the very strong and impressive statement on free speech published by the University of Chicago. I wish there were many more colleges that would follow suit. Colleges and universities can create freshman orientation programs on free speech. Colleges and universities can punish those who shut down or otherwise disrupt free speech, which, as we were discussing before lunch, involves infringement on free speech rights, both involving the right to speak and the right to listen, to hear a variety of opinions. Colleges and universities can issue an annual report on the state of free speech in campus. And here, perhaps most controversially, I'd be happy to discuss it more, it seems to me colleges and universities should strive where possible, and I recognize it's not always possible, but should strive where possible for institutional neutrality on the great partisan controversies of the day. The reason for that, though, is so that they can better serve as an arena for vigorous debate about the enduring questions. Okay, so much for those recommendations. I want to now emphasize that the problems of free speech on campus cannot be cured without also making progress dealing with questions of due process that have arisen and questions about the curriculum. Like the attacks on free speech, the attacks on due process implicate Mill's assumption of infallibility. Assumption of free speech. The attacks on free speech say, we don't need to hear that opinion, it's wrong, we already need the truth, we're better off without it. The attacks on due process imply, without the traditional protections accorded the accused in our criminal justice system, actually more generally, throughout our system, we can get at the truth of the matter. Typically, or I should say, all too often now throughout the country, campus proceedings dealing with allegations of sexual misconduct lack even the most basic due process protections. Universities have scaled back or eliminated the presumption of innocence. It is unfortunately not uncommon for universities to refer to the accused as perpetrator and the accuser as victim. They limit or eliminate the right to cross-examine. They restrict or deny the access to charges and evidence. They circumscribe or deny a right to counsel. And they often use the lowest evidentiary standard. For a while, from 2011 to 2017, not quite mandated, but pretty close by the federal government. That lowest standard is the preponderance of evidence, despite the gravity of the charge, sexual assault, and the severity of punishments, expulsion from the college or university. Please don't misunderstand. There's no room on campus for sexual harassment or sexual assault. Women who believe they've been harassed or assaulted should be able to come to college, the college authorities, and should be provided with immediate medical care, psychological counseling, if necessary, protection. In my own view, if they believe that they've been sexually assaulted, they should be encouraged to bring complaints with the police. I could go on, but time is short. So I'll only say here that the reform, it seems to me, of free speech and the reform of due process also rest on reforming the curriculum, because too many students graduate from our colleges and universities today with a poor understanding of the principles of free speech and a poor understanding of the principles of justice out of which our concerns about due process arose. That's connected to the hollowing and politicizing of the curriculum. Here again, the Mill's assumption of infallibility is at work. Many believe that either the history of our civilization is not worth knowing, we've transcended our past, and we should get on with thinking through the problems of the present, or we know what's essentially true about the past, that it's constituted by racism, sexism, and class bias, and we must overcome it. At many colleges and universities, the curriculum that is put before students is a great buffet, full of fascinating courses, but not connected by any unifying principle, and students are given very little guidance through the curriculum. In addition to that problem, at many colleges and universities, conservative ideas are routinely excluded, and aggressive promotion of progressive ideas is practiced. Worse still, from my point of view, is that the teaching of the liberal principles that ought to underlie liberal education, the teaching of those principles that explain why a proper liberal education includes instruction in progressive ideas, serious and sympathetic instruction in progressive ideas, serious and sympathetic examination of conservative ideas, why this is part and parcel of a liberal education. That's neglected. What should be done? Again, very briefly, at the very least, it seems to me the curriculum should include a mandatory course on the tradition of freedom, the modern tradition of freedom, the one that underlies the American constitutional tradition, or for that matter, the American constitutional tradition. Such courses would bring into focus the origins, the significance, the benefits, the complexities and ambiguities of free speech and due process. I'd like to see for all students a mandatory course, here maybe I'd indulge 2 courses, on the great moral, political, and religious questions and the seminal and conflicting answers. Of course, it's not the job of your college or university to teach you what are the right opinions about the great religious questions or philosophical questions, but to introduce you to what those questions are and the variety of answers, the influential answers that have been put forward throughout history, hugely important, with practical benefits in understanding the political challenges of the day. And of course, liberal education includes the education of education in non-Western civilizations, without an appreciation that civilizations respond to the challenges of our humanity differently. One cannot claim to be liberally educated. To keep within my time limit, I should finish in about 10 minutes. I'll just make a few remarks about how John Stuart Mill helps us think through the spirit of liberal education, the form of liberal education, and the content of liberal education. Although I think I will emphasize the spirit. Now, I'll emphasize the spirit by talking about two more works of Mill that seldom are studied these days. So, as a young man, John Stuart Mill was for a time the editor of the London and Westminster Review. It was a left liberal or progressive journal. Think of it more or less as the Atlantic of its day. During the period he edited it, he published two amazing tributes that he wrote. One, 1838, a tribute, a long tribute, 60 or 70 pages, to Jeremy Bentham. 1838. In 1840, he published a long tribute to Samuel Taylor Coleridge, both of whom had recently passed away. What was striking about his having published tributes to these figures? In his Bentham essay, Mill called these two men, Bentham and Coleridge, quote, the two great seminal minds of England in their age. The two great seminal minds of England in their age. Okay, what's odd about that? Well, Jeremy Bentham was a progressive, rationalist, social scientist, reformer. Progressive, rationalist, social science reformer. And good for him. But Coleridge was a poet, philosopher, mystic, and political conservative. How could it be that John Stuart Mill thought that a progressive social scientist reformer and a conservative poet mystic were both the great seminal minds of the age, the two great seminal minds of the age? Shouldn't one have to choose left or right, poet or social scientist, conservative or progressive? Mill's answer is, nothing could be more foolish. No, one has to, and in this case, one can learn incredible amounts from both of them. Mill wrote, I quote now, to Bentham it was given to discern more particularly those truths with which existing doctrines and institutions were at variance. To Coleridge, the neglected truths which lay in them. What's Mill saying? Take any practice, institution, law. It's likely, Mill is suggesting, that it will be defective in some manner. It will not fully accomplish its aim. It will fall short. But it's also very likely, especially if the law has been around a long time, it will serve some purpose. It will have conferred some benefit. It will embody some wisdom. Bentham was very good as the social scientist, progressive reformer, in seeing how laws fall short. Coleridge was expert in appreciating the purpose that the law had served. I'll read one more passage from the Bentham essay to give you more of a flavor of the spirit in which Mill wrote about these two great figures. He writes, the truths which are not Bentham's, which his philosophy takes no account of, are many and important. There was much that was important that Bentham just missed as a social scientist. But his non-recognition of them does not put them out of existence. They are still with us. And it is a comparatively easy task that is reserved for us to harmonize those truths with his. In other words, it falls upon us to harmonize Coleridge's truths with Bentham's truths. To reject his half of the truth because he overlooked the other half would be fall into his error without having his excuse. For our own part, we have a large tolerance, Mill's writing, for one-eyed men. We have a large tolerance for one-eyed men, provided their one eye is a penetrating one. If they saw more, they would probably not see so keenly, nor so eagerly pursue one course of inquiry. Almost all rich veins of original and striking speculation have been opened by systematic half-thinkers. Systematic half-thinkers. Though whether these new thoughts drive out others as good or are peacefully superadded to them depends on whether these half-thinkers are or are not followed in the same track by complete thinkers. That's another way of stating the task of liberal education. Many of the greatest thinkers have been systematic half-thinkers. With one eye, they saw with unusual precision a very important part of reality, but their vision did not incorporate the whole. We, especially as college students, have an opportunity over the course of 4 years to study a variety of these systematic half-thinkers and to turn ourselves into, at least put ourselves on the road to becoming complete thinkers. I should come to my conclusion. Although I'll make one comment or repeat one comment I've already made about Mill on the content of higher education. That content, from Mill's point of view, includes a serious and prolonged study of the classics, because the classics provide us with a perspective that is foreign to their own, because they write with a kind of simplicity and directness that we lack. That education involves the sciences. That education involves our own political ideas and institutions, the ones that have shaped us, the ones that within which we've lived, the ones that have conferred benefits, and the ones that in various ways inevitably will have fallen short. And that education involves the study of the great controversies, moral, philosophical, and religious. And one last comment about the form of liberal education. It must rest on free speech. Why? Free speech is crucial to the kind of education we're discussing. And Mill says, to understand free speech, you must appreciate that in regard to your own opinion, there are really only 3 possibilities, and each of those possibilities requires freedom of speech. The first possibility, painful as it may be, is that you could be wrong. In that case, you are a beneficiary of free speech because you will have an opportunity to hear the truth spoken. Second possibility, you're right. And let's stipulate, you're completely right, 100% right, totally right. You will still benefit, Mill argues, from free speech. Why? How can you benefit from free speech if you're already right? Because if you're never challenged, your opinions grow stale, withered, threadbare. You forget the assumptions on which they're based. You forget their implications, their reach. Even if you're right, confronting somebody with wrong opinions helps you more vigorously appreciate how you're right. But in truth, argued Mill, these are unusual circumstances. That you're right 100% or that you're wrong 100%. The most common circumstance for us, for human beings, is that our opinions are a mixture of true and false. In that case, by the way, it means that the other guy's or the other woman's opinions are also very likely a mixture of true and false. A community constituted by the principles of freedom of speech enables us to sift out what is false in our opinions and it enables us to sift out what is false in our opinions by achieving a better understanding of what's true and false in other people's opinions. The spirit, the content, the form of liberal education. I conclude. Of course, there are many criticisms to be put forward of what I've said. Here's one. You could say of what I said, of my warning against the politicization of liberal education, that the view that I've put forward is thoroughly political. Isn't it? I've said liberal education, I quoted Mill. Its aim is to form capable and cultivated human beings, fit for self-government, government of themselves, and participate in the life of the country. Isn't that thoroughly political? Yes and no. Liberal education is not neutral. It never promised to be neutral. Its explicit goal is to form individuals fit for freedom. To accomplish that, liberal education must be both political and not political at the same time. How? Liberal education should function as religion functioned in America in the 1830s, at least according to Tocqueville. Religion, Tocqueville argued, in Democracy in America was the first of America's political institutions because it stayed out of politics. I'm talking about the 1830s. By concentrating on its own affairs, on religious affairs, Tocqueville argued, religion rendered a great service to democracy. It fostered a moral character appropriate to democracy. Something similar, we should be able to say something similar about liberal education. For liberal education to contribute to liberal democracy in America, it must concentrate on its own affairs. It must focus on furnishing and refining students' minds. To do this, universities must foster free speech, safeguard due process, and provide a solid core to the curriculum. Certainly, students should demand nothing less from their colleges and universities. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Berkowitz. We are past the 1 o'clock hour, so if you need to slip away, we understand completely. But if you would like to continue the conversation, we will take 1 or 2 questions with Dr. Berkowitz.
Hi, my name's Elton. First of all, thank you for coming to speak. It was a very interesting talk, and my question is that you address a growing trend of attacks on free speech on college campuses, and from my experience, it is less common for progressive students to see their actions as denying the principle of free speech than as attacking views that are harmful to marginalized groups. So for example, students who hold views that are harmful to others, such as a student who holds that to be gay or transgender is a disease, as an example, are quick to use the excuse of free speech to justify such views. And so my question is, do you believe both free speech and respect for all humans are essential for a healthy college environment? And it seems that the former has gotten more mainstream attention than the latter, so how do you believe that both of these principles can be achieved in a college environment?
It's a good question and a hard question, but I think there's a good answer to it. First, it seems to me we need to distinguish the kinds of harms that the law prohibits or protects you from and the kinds of harms that college laws prohibit or protect you from. It seems to me, without denying the pain that can be caused by opinions contrary to your own, opinions about gender and sex, it's not the business of universities and it's not the business of the state to be protecting people from those kinds of harms and injuries. You say, well, what about respect? There is basic respect, it seems to me, colleges and universities are obliged to protect. And that is the respect that's owed to all of us as thinking human beings. no physical violence against us, and every opportunity for every student of every race, creed, and color, again, to listen to a variety of opinions and hear them. I think it is actually, my own opinion, is that we cause more injury to students by encouraging them to believe that an opinion is an act of violence than we would if we encourage students to have the courage and fortitude to listen to opinions they find painful and to respond to them with evidence and arguments. That's the real service. That's how we show respect to all of our students, it seems to me. Here.
Thank you very much for your speech and for your ideas and for your courage. I suppose my comment is a version of the first question or comment, and it has to do with the distinction between free speech and hate speech. I think that that's what that seems to be the core of this particular
Yes.
issue. In my opinion, hate speech is an abuse of free speech. And in that sense, it has no place in civil discourse. In other words, at the moment when we engage in any kind of hate speech, basically what we are doing is eliminating the possibility of dialogue and the possibility of exchange. If I happen to raise my voice in a harsh tone in response to your speech, then obviously I am being disrespectful towards you. And the net effect of that raising of the voice and of that abuse is, in fact, to diminish the benefit of my own arguments, so that the abuse of free speech through hate speech is, in effect, self-defeating.
Well,
It is self-destructive. And therefore, that seems to me, and obviously whichever policy can follow this is up to administrators and universities, but from the point of view of the individual, that should be the moment of recognition of my own strength through the recognition of the other's abuse.
Thank you for those observations. However, it seems to me that your own example explains to us why we nevertheless should not be regulating hate speech. It turns out there are a variety of ways of subverting the possibility of communication. One is rudely raising my voice. Another is looking away during a conversation. The other is, ignoring your good points, pretending they weren't spoken, and addressing a straw man. But I don't want the college authorities regulating all of those speech acts, because they're going to make a lot of mistakes. And they'd be, if we had colleges in the business of regulating everything that subverted the possibility of serious conversation, we'd have no conversation. Moreover, it seems to me the authorities, college authorities, over the last 20 years, have proven what the hardline free speech advocates always said, which is the authorities cannot be trusted to distinguish responsibly between speech that some people regard hateful and dissenting opinions. Now, I'm not denying in principle the reality of hate speech. I affirm it in principle. There is truly hateful speech. I don't think we can regulate it, and because there's so many other ways of subverting speech, I'm against creating, at the end of the day, thought police. But I want to make one other point, and This goes to a conversation I had with the president of the college earlier today. I'm delighted to see Claremont, and I would be delighted to see other colleges teaching the virtues of conversation. That's hugely important for the reasons you subtly mentioned, which is also there are all kinds of ways to subvert speech. In fact, at the end of chapter 2 of On Liberty, the most famous chapter of Liberty of Thought and Discussion, Mill explicitly addresses this question of regulation. He says, definitely not, it would be abused. He then describes something that he calls the real morality of public discussion. And the real morality of public discussion involves the virtues of excellent speaking and the virtues of excellent listening, both of which are arts. I'm all for cultivating these on campuses to minimize the examples of hateful speech on campus, because, as you say, that prevents us from enjoying one another and making progress in our common pursuit of truth. So let us cultivate the virtues that let us engage in productive conversation.
We are unfortunately out of time. Is it a quick question?
Yeah, kind of. I can say it quickly.
I'll make it a quick answer.
So the schools you mentioned that had these liberal or these free speech kerfuffles,
Yeah.
Evergreen and
Yes.
UC Berkeley, do you think that, or my understanding is that those are quite liberal institutions themselves, do you think that free speech, like threats to free speech are inherently tied to like liberalism, or just perhaps like an echo chamber type scenario?
Great question. I'll be brief. Historically, or for many decades, if not centuries, free speech was the province of the left, of the progressive left. I actually think it's, well, there's a long answer, but I'm promised to keep it short. I believe it's tied to being a majority, and so it's more your echo chamber. It's tied to being a massive majority on campus. Insofar as progressives on some campuses constitute massive majorities, as I said, they engage in a practice which is instinctive. To define the other guy's or the other woman's speech as, we say hate speech today, once we said blasphemy, okay? As something that contributes nothing to the public conversation and should be silenced. So I think improving diversity of opinion on campus, real diversity of opinion on campus would go a long way toward improving the situation, including alterations in the curriculum. Thanks a lot. Thank you.